without further ado, questions? Don't be shy.
Especially students.
Yes, sir.
So I have one. So I'm going to be traveling to Lebanon, hopefully, this January to do some research. But one of the concerns I have is in the event of foreign intervention in Syria. Do you think that foreign intervention in Syria is a serious risk? And if so, what would be the fallout from that?
It's a serious risk. Turkey. One possibility is that Turkey may intervene just to carve out a safe area in the north because they don't like the idea of people fleeing into Turkey. I think Western intervention is the West doesn't intervene on the ground. Like the U.S. just kills people from the air. They don't want to take a chance of anybody shooting at them. So if there's Western intervention, it would probably be bombing, drones, things like that. There could be a substantial fallout. It's a complex area. I mean, this is, the dominant political force in Lebanon is Hezbollah, which is closely linked to Syria. Syria is the source of their arms from Iran. And they could react to an attack on Syria in many ways. For one thing, they could disrupt a lot of things in Lebanon. And there could be an effort to spread the war across the border. And you don't know how Syria is going to react. They have a big army. A military intervention would probably be the worst thing possible. There's some of the people who really know Syria well and are very critical of the Assad regime. Have written about this. If you haven't read it yet, you might want to read Patrick Seale, who's kind of the main historian of Syria. Has been around for a long time. Seale, and there's a very good British journalist who's worked a lot in the Middle East, Jonathan Steele, Steele, who's also been writing about the dangers of military intervention and the need to find some sort of a negotiated settlement. It's a very complex situation. The country's split, and military intervention could lead to there already is a civil war, but it could exacerbate it and make it could turn it into something like Iraq was like, with violent sectarian warfare, totally out of hand. You don't know where it's going to go, and the region is very inflammable altogether. However, I suspect you'll be about as safe in Beirut as you are in New York.
What about New Paltz?
Yeah, or New Paltz. Yeah. Although I hear there are terrorists aiming at the aqueduct here.
Other questions? Yes, in the back there. Please speak up loudly, you sir.
What is your opinion on the role of music and literature affecting change?
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Yeah, I'll say he's asking about the role of music and literature in affecting change in global politics.
Well, it certainly had a big impact. It's always the art forms, murals, literature, music have always been parts of active social movements. It's certainly been true here throughout my lifetime, but way back. There's a slightly negative side to it, which was caught once in a, Tom Lehrer, or seen that your generation? Yeah, well, there's a great satirist named Tom Lehrer, he was a songwriter. He stopped writing. He was in the 60s, but you can pick up his records. He had one song, you maybe remember the words, in which he said, they win all the battles, but we have all the best songs. That's something like that. Yeah.
Those are the words.
So there's that aspect. But it does, it always invigorates social movements. It's a mode of solidarity.
Hey, everyone.
Well, why don't you answer? You probably answer better than I can do.
I'll just say something relevant to Howard Zinn, because of today's theme and the reason for us being here, being Howard. Howard was someone who had a real appreciation for the role of the arts in social change. He was very interested in theater, took part in theater, wrote plays. If you ever get a chance to see any of his plays, they're really terrific works. But in his own process of becoming conscious and politicized and becoming the historian, the people's historian that he became, he really credits a kind of decisive turning point being listening to the music of Woody Guthrie. And he heard a song in particular that Woody Guthrie wrote about a massacre of striking coal workers in Colorado in 1913 in Ludlow. And he had this moment of realizing that he was learning about this labor struggle, this strike, this repression, through a song by Woody Guthrie, but he had never heard about this struggle in any of his courses in history. He had never read about it in any of the textbooks of U.S. history that he was required to read. And it was really a moment when he began to understand the difference between the way history is taught in this country and the actual histories that had been excluded from the official history from above, and began becoming interested in history as a profession for himself, and understanding that you had to tell history a different way from below, and that an essential part of that would be understanding cultural expression, song, music, theater, the arts. And so I think that was one of the remarkable things about Howard is he's always weaving in throughout his work references to novels, to poetry, to song, to literature, and it was certainly something that sustained him throughout so much of his own work and life. Seeing early plays put on by the Work Progress Administration in New York at a time when theater was actually accessible to working class people, unlike today. Although, interestingly, last weekend in New York, there was an Occupy Broadway action, and people went to Broadway and did public theater for free throughout Saturday, actually, performances of great pieces of theater and monologues and other plays were performed to try to reclaim that public space, which has become so commercialized, so privatized, where Broadway theater tickets now are $150, $200 tickets.
Did they have participation from professionals?
Yeah.
They did.
So, professional actors, people like Kathleen Chalfant, who was in the film Howard Zinn and I did, The People Speak, was part of that. And that's another interesting aspect of Occupy, actually, the number of musicians who've gone down and performed, Tom Morello performing, Miley Cyrus remarkably releasing a video in solidarity with Occupy. So it's when that dynamic starts happening, where the social movements are informing popular music and popular music's informing social movements, it can be very powerful.
All right, next question. All the way in the back, you, sir.
I was at the Occupy New York City last week, and it turned out that the New York City General Assembly took a decision to send a group of 20 people to Cairo to monitor the Egyptian elections. That seemed like a very big mistake. Luckily, our counterparts on the Egyptian side, they said, no, thank you, we don't need that, we have enough of that already. But there were fears that the Department of Homeland Security had infiltrated the movement, and that's why they ended up taking a decision like that. Now, whether they had or not, how could we possibly guard against making mistakes like this?
Did you hear it? Yeah, I heard it. First of all, I don't know what happened in that case, but it could be a perfectly honest decision. I mean, there have been interconnections between Tahrir Square and not only the Occupy movements, but also the Wisconsin movement before it. And trying to, maybe this isn't the best way to establish the connections, probably not, given what the elections were, but an effort to try to make those international connections, to raise them to the level of personal interchange, that's not a bad idea, I think. The way to deal with decisions that you think are faulty is through the General Assembly discussions. And there's plenty of opportunities for interaction. There's also there doesn't really have to be consensus on these things. Different groups can try different things. Of that, I agree. That was not the wisest thing to try because of the nature of the elections. But that may not have been appreciated by the people who were making the decision. They may have, I don't know who they were, but they might have quite honestly felt that this is a way to respond to the gestures of solidarity and support that had come from the Egyptian movement.
Yes, ma'am.
So bilingual education and foreign language education is on a very steady decline in our education system, especially in primary and secondary schooling. And I think a lot of that comes from a lack of just knowledge of what linguistics is. So do you think it's a good idea to introduce the study of linguistics into maybe a secondary education or even primary?
Well, I suspect that the attack on bilingual education is more part of the general anti-immigrant hysteria, and stop taking our country away from us. We don't want to, the nativist element that's saying we want to keep our old white culture, don't take it away, is spreads out to things like this. Whether one should teach linguistics at the secondary level is a separate question, really. I don't think it'll contribute one way or another to the issue of bilingual education. There are things that can be done that make some sense, in fact. So, for example, teaching linguistics at the school level can get students interested in indigenous languages, indigenous cultures, also the variety of cultures that exist here, which is enormous. New York City, a very multi-ethnic society. And that's one way to get into it. Another thing that could be done, which actually has been done with some success, is to use linguistics as a way to introduce students to science. Like when an eighth grader studies chemistry, it's all kind of arbitrary. So you mix these two things together and they turn blue. Anything could have happened. So this happens and you memorize that. And on the other hand, you can use data that people know, children know, namely their own language. There they have the data. It's accessible to them. And a linguistics program that introduces kids to scientific thinking and rational argument and explanatory theory, making use of data that they command, where they can in fact invent new cases. They can invent their own experiments because they have the data. In fact, that can be a very effective way to introduce just, first of all, scientific education, but even just rational thinking. There have been some programs trying that have worked pretty well with 6th, 7th grade kids. And I think that's something that could be, it's one of the few ways in which you can introduce basically scientific thinking, or just being reasonable about things, figuring out what an argument is, what evidence is, how you test hypotheses and so on, by making use of data that's already available. The kid doesn't have to look it up in a book. They got it in their head.
Yes.
Can you please comment on the Palestinian UN statehood bid and the United States opposition to it and their insistence that the Palestinians and the Israelis return to the negotiating table?
UN statehood bid and the U.S. reaction to it.
Well, you have to recognize that there've been the way the negotiations are set up. The U.S. And Europe, unfortunately, goes along, insists on a particular mode for dealing with the problem. The way this is described here is that the Palestinians insist on preconditions, and Israel's eager to proceed without preconditions, and the U.S. wants them all to get around the table and proceed without preconditions. Like a lot of standard doctrine, it's exactly the truth is exactly the opposite. If there were honest negotiations going on, serious ones, they would be run by some neutral party, some country that has some respect in the world, like maybe Brazil or some country like that. And there would be two sides in the negotiations. On the one side would be the United States and Israel. On the other side would be the rest of the world. Because that's in fact exactly what the conflict has been for 35 years. Now the U.S. and Israel insist on strict preconditions. One of them is that the U.S. must run the negotiations. Well, that's like saying Israel must run the negotiations. Of course, that's not going to get anywhere. In fact, at the UN a couple of times there have been efforts to try to have a UN-run negotiation process. And that, the last time that came up in the General Assembly, I think the vote was 144 to 2. 144 in favor of it, United States and Israel against it. So that's dead. If the United States is against something, it doesn't happen. And in fact, it's out of history too. You didn't learn about it. But the negotiations, that's what the negotiations would be. Another precondition that the U.S. and Israel insist on is that settlements must continue in the occupied territories. Now, there's a lot of talk about expanding settlements, but that's a kind of a triviality. The settlements themselves are illegal. There's no doubt about that. There's no debate about it. Every relevant international authority, World Court, the Security Council, anyone who matters, even the State of Israel agrees that the settlements themselves are illegal. They're violations of the Geneva Conventions, which is the core of international humanitarian law. You can't transfer population into occupied territory. But if you insist that the settlements not only stay, but continue to expand as a precondition, which is what the U.S. and Israel do, then that, again, undermines further the possibility of negotiations. Furthermore, Israel has already announced pretty clearly that there are settled areas in the occupied territories that they intend to annex, and the U.S. backs them up on that. So that's another precondition. And under those conditions, of course, negotiations are going to get nowhere. And the Palestinian Authority, I could ask whether the tactic was right or not, but they decided to see if they could break that logjam by going straight to the United Nations. Well, the U.S. made it very clear they'll never let anything go through the Security Council. There, the U.S. has a veto, and the U.S. has been working overtime to prevent it, to prevent the issue from coming up to the point where they'll have to cast the veto, because the veto will be very unpopular throughout most of the world, and the U.S. standing in the world is already extremely low. Obama himself is by now practically a figure of ridicule. In the Arab world, I mean, he succeeded. He made a real achievement. He succeeded in surpassing Bush in unpopularity. That's quite a trick. I think Bush was 8%. He managed to get to 5% or something like that. So they don't want to cast the veto. So they're trying very hard to pressure other countries not to vote for it in the Security Council. They have to get 9 votes to go through, and 1 veto would stop it. And probably that'll work. But if it goes to the General Assembly, then there'll be an overwhelming vote in favor of it, but a General Assembly vote has no effect, just like the vote that I mentioned, 144 to 2 has no effect. You already saw what happened when UNESCO agreed to accept the Palestinians. The U.S. immediately defunded UNESCO. That's 25% of their budget. It's not the first time, incidentally. In 1984, the U.S. pulled out of UNESCO altogether because it had too much of a third world orientation. And next year it stopped paying its UN dues totally because UN wasn't enough under control. But it's Reagan. The one thing that they're very worried about, both of them, is that the Palestinians might be accepted. If the Palestinian, at the General Assembly, they can't, there's no technical way in which a General Assembly vote could admit Palestine as a state, but they could give them what's called an enhanced observer status, sort of like the Vatican. And that would enable them to, it would be an opening at least to enter into other UN organizations. And one that is very troublesome to the U.S. and Israel, they don't talk about it publicly, is they might be admitted into the International Criminal Court. And if they are, they can bring charges against Israel for war crimes. The International Criminal Court, the statute on which it's based, does say that a violation of the Geneva Conventions is a war crime. And there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Israel is in gross violation of the Geneva Conventions. Israel doesn't accept ICC jurisdiction, just like the U.S. doesn't, but it would still be a big propaganda step. So these are the maneuverings kind of going on in the background. The U.S. is determined to maintain control of the diplomatic process, which means to run the negotiations, which is a guarantee that they won't get anywhere, unless U.S. policy changes radically, which could happen, of course.
Okay, lots of hands right now.
Could you tell us a little bit about the day or even the moment when you really solidified your theory on universal grammar and like how that felt?
It's still not solidified. This is science, not religion. So every time a graduate student walks into your office, you may change your mind. But in fact, that's what students are supposed to be for, to innovate, get new ideas. So a lot is in flux, but there's some things that are, so obvious that it's kind of almost embarrassing even it's odd that it's a debatable subject, if you think about it, because there's something that's obvious beyond discussion. What's obvious beyond discussion is that if, say, a newborn infant, say, has a pet chimpanzee or a pet kitten or whatever you like, pet songbird, and if they get exactly the same experience from birth, the infant will instantly, reflexively, carry out an operation which no one understands. It's sort of miraculous. Somehow the infant selects out of the environment. The environment's just a massive noise, but the infant selects out of it information that's relevant to language. Now, no one knows how that's done. None of the other pets can do any of that. Like the chimpanzee has essentially the same auditory system, but it can't do it. And then the infant goes on pretty much reflexively till it's doing what you and I are doing right now, which is completely impossible for any other organism. Well, either it's a miracle or there's some genetic element that determines this capacity. Well, the name for the genetic element is just universal grammar. So the existence of the genetic component shouldn't really be debated. It is debated, but it's just some confusion, because there's nothing. It's like questioning whether we have a genetic element that determines that we have a mammalian visual system or an insect visual system. And it's not the nutrition and that goes to the embryo that determines that. It's something in the genes. Then the question remains, well, what is it? Okay, that's a scientific question. You can have all kind of opinions about it. When this became obvious, I don't know, probably the first time I started thinking about language, because it really is obvious. What's kind of sociologically or maybe culturally interesting is that it's considered debatable. It's considered kind of a strange hypothesis.
Yes, can you talk about your impression of the Occupy Wall Street movement?
Well, I think it's a very exciting development. It's the first major popular reaction in the United States, there have been some elsewhere, to what has been a global onslaught against the general population for well over a generation. A lot of people are angry, plenty of people are upset, they don't like it. In the United States, anger is enormous. Hatred of institutions is enormous. like Congress, support for Congress in single digits. The president not much higher. People hate the banks, they hate the scientists, they hate everything. But this is the first, and they've been, people here don't suffer the way you do in a third world country, but you're suffering by the standards of what ought to be true in the richest, most powerful country in history. And people feel that, but they haven't reacted. Okay, this is the first reaction. It's, for that reason alone, it's significant. And it's been a very a remarkably successful reaction. It's changed, even if it were to terminate tomorrow, it's achieved substantial successes. So there are things being discussed now in the mainstream which were kind of suppressed. Obvious things, like, say, the radical inequality in the country. The slogan, 99%, 1%, is actually a little wrong. It should be more like 99.9% than 0.1%. Because if you look at the radical inequality in the country that's grown over the past generation, it's very heavily weighted by the top 1/10 of 1% of the population, which has gotten just spectacularly wealthy, and with wealth comes political power, so that changes legislation, sets off a vicious cycle, and people are certainly suffering from that. And there's just an enormous chasm now between what the public wants and what policymakers do in Washington. And instead of the anger about that just being unfocused, let's hate everything, this is the first effort, and surprisingly successful one, to try to get people organized to do something about it. I think it's very exciting, and it's now spread to, I think, about 100 countries. And there are independent developments in other countries that have fed into it: Spain, Greece, Middle East, and so on. So it's a worldwide movement, not for the, not totally from nothing, of course, but on a different scale than anything that's happened for generations. So I think that's a really exciting development. Has plenty of promise if people can. It's going to face real difficulties. Serious difficulties are already coming, and it's going to have to change. I mean, it's been a brilliant and successful tactic, but tactics have a kind of a half-life. They start having diminishing returns after a while, and you have to separate the tactic from the principle, and at some point you have to turn to other tactics, and I think that time is not far off. The other tactics are going to have to be things like what Anthony was saying, bringing this to broader communities so that the 99% can actually participate and have their own inputs into what ought to be done. And that means, developing sustained, dedicated, popular movements. Doesn't have to be a single one. Popular movements which will be willing to devote themselves to the long-term, arduous effort to reverse processes that are very harmful to the country and the world, and that just can't go on much longer without real disaster.
I'm a student at Bard College where I'm doing a senior project with an undergraduate thesis on the Central American solidarity movements of the 1980s, which I know you participated in and written about. Do you think they were successful? And do you think there's lessons that can be drawn from that model, like going to Nicaragua or El Salvador when opposing U.S. intervention there, that contemporary social movements could draw on at all?
Asking about lessons of the 80s Central America.
The Central American Solidarity Movement?
Yes.
Well, they were pretty important. They didn't prevent what happened in Central America in the 1980s was a complete disaster. A couple 100,000 people were murdered. There's hundreds of thousands of widows, orphans. The countries were largely devastated. It didn't just begin in the 80s, but it really picked up then. In fact, a lot of the immigration now, illegal immigration, is still, to this day, literally to this day, is people fleeing from the wreckage of the Reagan's terrorist wars in El Salvador. It's not too well known, but around eastern Massachusetts, for example, there's a pretty big Mayan community. These are people fleeing right to the present from the Guatemalan highlands, where there was virtual genocide in the 1980s against the Mayan community, and similar things elsewhere. Honduras is a special case. That's the one country where the United States did succeed in carrying out a military coup. Military coups used to be routine, but the capacity to implement them has reduced. But Obama did manage a military coup in Honduras. I didn't call it that, but there was a military coup throughout the elected president, and Latin America and even Europe was strongly opposed to it and took measures against it. Obama kind of, and Clinton kind of, put out some nice rhetoric, ended up supporting it. And in fact, the president elected under the military regime was just welcomed in Washington very lavishly and so on. Honduras is an absolute wreck. Has the worst homicide rate maybe in the world, certainly in Latin America. There's tremendous repression of activists. It is very violent and repressive. So the other countries have changed somewhat. Guatemala is still a horror story. But despite all of this, the Solidarity movement did have effects. Could be a lot worse. As bad as it was, it could have been a lot worse. I mean, the forces that were struggling against the dictatorships mostly survived, and some of them have even gone forward in the political arena. So in El Salvador now, the government is based pretty much on a political group that kind of grew out of the guerrillas. In Nicaragua, still a Sandinista president, and not still, but again, it was a break. So there was some space for survival, and the Solidarity movements shouldn't take credit for that. They were also very valuable here. These Solidarity movements have a kind of a double function. For one thing, they do help the victims, but they also help civilize the United States. You learn about things. You learn about the rest of the world. You learn about your own country. It's an impetus to change things in your country that lead to actions like that. And in many ways, that's, I think, ends up being the most positive aspect of the Solidarity movements. It's a little bit like the Peace Corps in that respect. I don't know how much the Peace Corps actually helps people in the countries to which Peace Corps volunteers go, but it's had a very good effect on the United States. This is a really insular country. People don't know anything about the outside world, and you can see why. I mean, it's you go from, say, Boston to Los Angeles, 3,000 miles, and it looks exactly like where you came from. Same McDonald's, same language, same music, whatever. A little difference, but not much. Most parts of the world, say Europe, you go 100 miles or so, different culture. So it ends up being very insular, also very rich, that wins all its wars and so on. But getting some understanding of what the rest of the world is like and what we do to the rest of the world, that's very educational. And people who've worked in a village in, say, Ghana or Colombia or something, they do get to see an aspect of the world that you wouldn't know otherwise, and they bring it back. And that's been helpful here. And I think that was true of the Solidarity movements. They're one of the strains that feeds into the Occupy movements that are developing today. They come from a lot of sources. But part of it is just the international solidarity.
All right, we have time for one more question, and this one is going to go to you, Anne. Nice and loud, please.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on the bill that Senate recently passed, which declares the United States a battleground and gives the military basically unchecked power to do whatever they want to U.S. citizens. So I was wondering what your thoughts were and maybe how the citizens could fight back against it.
There's a lot of internet chatter on that, but I suggest some caution. I mean, the original bill that was introduced was pretty bad. But there was a reaction to it, even inside Washington. And it's been cut back The final bill that was passed, or that's coming to vote, pretty explicitly says it's not going to change the law. The law is bad enough. And the existing law is horrible. And in fact, it pretty much does give the government authority to keep, in fact, not pretty much, it does give the authority to the president to keep people under preventive detention indefinitely. Now, it doesn't extend at the moment to American citizens, but Obama's already made it clear that he has the right to murder American citizens. That was the killing of Awlaki and another American citizen who happened to be unfortunate enough to be in the same car with him. That's murdering American citizens because the president doesn't like them. That goes well beyond keeping them under detention. But it's true that up until now, the law doesn't explicitly allow the president to keep American citizens under preventive detention. Preventive detention, remember, is a very serious attack on the fundamental conception of modern law. I mean, Anglo-American law is based on the principle of presumption of innocence. You're innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Well, that's been thrown to the winds for non-citizens, for people who are undocumented, and it's now spreading to citizens. But this particular bill, I think, doesn't deserve the Internet concern that it elicited. The concern should be real, but not on this bill, rather on the whole system of violation of basic legal principles, moral and legal principles that's just spreading before our eyes. I mean, even the things that don't arouse concern are shocking. Like, for example, there's so far been one trial of a Guantanamo prisoner under Obama. Just take a look at that one and think what that tells you about the country. You can look it up on Wikipedia. It's a child named Omar Khadr, Khadr. It's the first case of a child submitted to imprisonment law, maybe in American history, but certainly for a long time. This is a 15-year-old kid. His crime was, the accusation is that when American soldiers invaded his village in Afghanistan, he picked up a grenade to try to defend the village and killed an American soldier. That's the crime. Okay, that makes him a terrorist. In punishment for that crime, he was sent to first Bagram Air Base, which is worse than Guantanamo, and then to Guantanamo. He spent 8 years in, you know what Guantanamo is like, I don't tell you. He spent 8 years in these prisons, no lawyer, no nothing, because as a 15-year-old child, he tried to defend his village from the attack by U.S. soldiers. After 8 years, he was given a choice by the Obama administration, very benign. The choice was either plead guilty to the charges or else get what amounted to a permanent life sentence in a torture chamber. So his lawyer convinced him to plead guilty to these terrible charges. In return for that, he got 8 years more in prison. Now, just take a look at the reaction to that case and think what that tells you. What does that tell you about the country? To be able to even have a concept of terrorists like this. So if a child tries to defend his village from an attack by American soldiers, he's a terrorist, and therefore we can send him to a torture chamber for 16 years, without a whisper. Now, he's not a citizen, of course, but he's a human being. And even in the Awlaki case, to the little extent that, first of all, there wasn't much of a fuss about it. Like if you look at the New York Times the next day, it said, world celebrates death of Muslim cleric. Well, it wasn't death, it was a murder. And the world certainly isn't celebrating it. In fact, most of the world is horrified. But what they mean is privileged Americans in the New York Times editorial board. They think it's great, but and to the extent that there was any criticism of it, there was some. It was mostly because he was an American citizen, and maybe we shouldn't murder American citizens. Maybe we should just murder other people. But I think all of that is way more important than this particular bill, which was pared down so that its worst aspects don't seem to be in the final bill. So there's a lot to be worried about, but not that one particularly, I think.
All right. Well, those of you who had questions that weren't addressed, you'll have a chance during the main event at 4 o'clock in Lecture Center 100. Be sure to fill out one of the note cards that will be passed around, and join me in thanking Professor Chomsky.